We're trying to talk to mayoral candidates to hear their answers on some of the different issues impacting Black people around the city of Boston. Um, this particular event is sponsored by different organizations such as Cotton Square Neighborhood Development Corporation, the Male Engagement Network, Union Minority Neighborhoods, List Boston. We have ABCD Mattapan. We also have Keeping Cotton Square Affordable, New Estra CDC, and there's more. We'll Sister Circle, a whole bunch of great folks that we'll list out at the end as well.
During Mayor Walsh's tenure, Boston has approved a large amount of real estate developments across the city. Many of these developments have widened inequalities in the at-risk neighborhoods. As mayor, what is your plan to increase diversity of approved developers within small business owners and real estate developers?
It's certainly a question of making sure that we're building what people need where they are, and that we are including the community in those discussions in a more meaningful way. Excuse me. Something that I've called for, just sort of broadly on the development side, something that I've called for as a city councilor, and I'm a believer in being consistent, so I've worked on it. If I've worked on it as a city councilor, it will continue in my capacity as mayor, that we should be doing developer profiles, so that when someone is building in a community, whether it's a residential property or a commercial property, that information about that developer and that development team is shared with the community, and that we are creating opportunities both on the small business side, but also on the development side for community members to access those opportunities, that we are creating pathways to capital, so that if a community member wants to open their own business, to start a new venture, an enterprise, that we as a city, through our Office of Small Business Development, are creating those opportunities to access capital. I've actually been pushing and advocating for the ARP money, the American Rescue Plan money that's coming in from the feds, that it be spent in two ways. One, around the opioid crisis and supporting those that are experiencing homelessness, substance use disorder, stimulant use disorder, and mental health illness, that we're investing some dollars there, both at Mass and Cass, but across our city, because what's happening at Mass and Cass is happening in every one of our neighborhoods across the city of Boston, but that we're also using that money in a very real way to support our small businesses, to help our entrepreneurs invest, to reinvest, to stabilize, to then grow, and look for new opportunities. And then as it relates to the work of the city, that we are, and I filed a home rule petition that would help us move towards this, make sure that we are engaging with businesses owned by Black and Brown and women of color, that we are allowing them greater opportunities to bid on city jobs, to become city vendors, to do business with the city of Boston. And we've got some work to do in that space. We know the statistics: less than 1% of all city contracts, of all city spend, is spent on Black-owned, Brown-owned, or woman of color-owned or woman-owned businesses. And through our work on the council and this home rule petition, we've created some opportunities to break up those larger RFPs that go out, those larger contracts, so that there's more opportunity, greater opportunity for a locally owned and businesses owned by people of color to bid on those jobs. And then it's back to that home ownership piece. It's helping our city's residents access the capital around down payment assistance, and creating opportunities for ownership in our neighborhoods across the city. And it has to be in every neighborhood.
Two things, and it connects back to one of the previous questions on just housing. So the vacant lot initiative, I will lift up again, because it isn't just creating home ownership opportunities for residents in the city of Boston, where people are taking advantage of some of these lots in order to build homes. It also was designed, and I was pushing for the design of the program to also allow for people of color, and particularly some smaller developers who are situated in neighborhoods and community, to also have access to these lots and to be able to develop on these lots. We even redesigned what the RFP would look like, because the current way in which it's done in the process is actually exclusionary because it requires so much extra information and things that usually smaller developers can't prove. And so it blocks them and is a barrier to them actually getting the opportunity. And so we have redesigned some of these RFPs, including for the 30 Blue Hill Ave parcels, to make it easier for folks from the community to be able to apply. And what is that going to do? It's going to allow them not only to develop things for their community, but also to build their wealth for themselves, their family, and for the community. I have the same types of plans within my housing plan, looking at some creative ideas. And I know Marilyn and Gail and others from Codman are on here. We talk about transfer developing rights, and there are creative ideas that the city hasn't maximized that would allow some of these larger development projects in the city of Boston to be transferred to some of the smaller CDCs and community-based organizations if we actually implemented some of these ideas to allow them to also build housing and affordable housing in the city of Boston. So there are tools that I would definitely deploy to ensure that we don't just talk about it, that it actually happens, and it frankly builds upon the work I've already been doing to create these type of opportunities in my current district, of course, but I would do across the city of Boston.
That's a great question. And so I'll talk about both the fact that I've got a track record of doing this work in my neighborhood. And as mayor, if I'm making the final call, that's how I lead. So as executive director of the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, we built a land trust, the largest urban land trust in the country, to help make sure that we had permanent affordable housing and commercial space for our residents. And I would, in the first 100 days, make sure that there was a fund available to build capacity for community to do work like that and build community land trusts, and to make sure that we had funding for acquisition of land. There are TA providers out there that can help and are ready to work with communities in acquiring land and moving development forward on land trusts. The other piece that I would introduce would be a neighborhood investment fund. They have some that exist around the country that allows for community residents to work with a fund that would invest in any real estate that's happening in the neighborhood. So for instance, I see some developers on the line. Let's say David Price through New Westra was going to build some housing. Well, there should be a community investment fund that allows John Barrows, who lives in that neighborhood, to maybe buy some shares in that investment housing and be able to pay $100 a share, $200 a share, and figure out how Mrs. Jones next door to me can buy some shares, so that we can be part of the development and the improvement in our neighborhood, not just by saying what happens, by being part of the wealth creation that happens in our neighborhoods. And then, so in a neighborhood investment fund, what typically happens is you take resident money, you bring in CRA money, you bring in PRI money, you bring in other investment money to create something of impact. So that, in fact, it could help move that development forward, but also have community stake in that development. And I think those are really important ways to make sure that our community can be part of their future, and so that development is not displacing us, but development has us in place. Let me just talk about 4 policies that I brought in as Chief of Economic Development. One is, in the RFPs that we did in Nubian Square and the ones that we put out in Upham's Corner, in the effort that I led in Upham's Corner, there were 3 policies. A good jobs analysis to make sure that there were good jobs coming into our neighborhood on developments that were going to be built on city land. A two-thirds affordable framework, one-third deep affordable, one-third moderate, one-third market. And then there was a diversity analysis that would score proposals that came in to build on that land, that looked at diversity in ownership, diversity in 7 different things. I'll talk about ownership. It looked at diversity in funding in terms of who had money in it. It looked at diversity in construction, in diversity in employment, diversity in architecture, diversity in legal, et cetera. And then it had a displacement analysis, and basically said, we need to know what your proposal is going to do in terms of displacement in the neighborhood. We need a full analysis those are policies that I put in place as Chief of Economic Development. And as mayor, we'll continue to move. And as you guys suggest, we'll continue to move it as part of zoning in the city of Boston and make sure that we had a full analysis of what was going to be built in our city and whether it worked for our neighborhoods or not.
This is just a tragedy, a travesty that we saw the seaport, a whole new multi-billion-dollar neighborhood built up in the seaport, and it only went to reinforce wealth in the same communities, both on the development side and on the
Can you give me a
homeownership
second,
side.
Michelle? Can someone mute their phone?
I think I'll say,
Thank you.
both on the development side and on the homeownership side, right? It's a new neighborhood that doesn't reflect our city, doesn't reflect our population and our communities. I've been leading the charge here for more than 5 years. It was at first just something we would hear in the community, stories of how companies that were owned by Black and brown entrepreneurs had a hard time getting contracts, but no one quite knew exactly how much it was or what the gap was. And so it was only after the ordinance that I partnered with then Councillor Presley to write and to pass in 2017 that required accountability for the city to report out on all these numbers so we could measure what was happening, and to require supplier diversity, to give preference through our RFP process, the request for proposals or bidding process for Black and brown businesses, women-owned businesses to have preference, locally owned businesses, et cetera. And so that passed in 2017. I had to subpoena the first report in compliance with this. And it was after that that we got the first set of numbers in 2018. 0.65% of that $664 million went to businesses owned by people of color in this majority BIPOC city. And even in the look back of the disparity study that resulted from Ayana's and my advocacy, we're now just up to 2.5% of the billions of dollars that were spent to MWBEs, and of that, only 1.2% went to Black and Latinx owned businesses. And so the previous administration on the way out set a goal that this current administration has kept, which is a 10% goal of MBEs, right? Minority business enterprises. 10% is not even scratching the surface of what's possible, much less what we should be aiming for and pushing ourselves to achieve, right? In a majority people of color city, we should be leading the country with the contracts that we're putting our money where our mouth is. Chicago is well over 20% in terms of contracts to people of color. Philadelphia is well over 30%. We can't settle for 10%. Sometimes people will say 25% as the goal, but it's really 15% women-owned businesses and 10% minority business enterprises. And so it's really clear. We have to be clear and intentional about what those goals break down into. So how do we make that happen? I've also passed legislation to ensure, just on one example, through food, that we are doing everything we can to tie the money we spend into our own communities to build wealth and to close gaps. And so our food justice ordinance made it so that now every single dollar that's spent on Boston Public Schools meals has to go with a preference towards locally produced food, healthy and nutritious, environmentally sustainable, fair wages, as well as racial equity in choosing the vendors and the sub-vendors. That's $18 million of our city funds that way, but we've already started the process of pushing big partners in the city to do the same thing. Between city government, all the hospitals serving meals, all the universities serving meals, that's at least $100 million for local jobs and for closing the racial wealth gap and food justice, just on food. And so, it's about completing the cycle with the city and our public government, contracts, creating opportunity, and also preferencing worker-owned co-ops so that when we give out those contracts, it goes to reinforce wealth for each of the employees and for families that are living right in our city.